Okay, so these are the notes to help you fill in the energy flow in ecosystem notes. So as I'm going through this on here, I want you to be writing it down as well on your own so that you have a completed set of notes. So let's start with the top. Okay, everything that living organisms do requires, and the word that we're going to put in here is energy. Everything that we do requires some form of energy. And the energy that we're talking about all stems from initially the sun. So let's talk about what trophic levels are. Trophic levels are the levels of an ecosystem that group organisms based on their function in a food chain. Each step of energy transfer through that ecosystem. So down here, when we're looking at this little pyramid on the bottom, these would each be a trophic level, okay? So let's talk first about what producers or autotrophs are. So producers and autotrophs are synonyms. A good way to remember producers is that they produce their own food. Also, the root word auto means self. So they make food all by themselves. So to define them, we're going to say that they make their own food. So a good example of organisms that make their own food are plants. Okay. And then consumers or heterotrophs, they consume their food, right? They don't make it on their own. And hetero means different. So they're eating something different other than themselves. So in this case, they need to eat their food. So for example, animals. And the last one that we don't want to forget are these guys down here that are decomposers. And decomposers don't really fit perfectly into this food chain. They would be more so like over on the side because they decompose or break down dead things. So organisms such as, oops, be great if I spelled things right. Organisms such as worms or fungi, also bacteria, are all different types of decomposers. And decomposers are very important because they return that organic material, right? These dead things that were once living, they return that material back into the soil. So they can be very important for ecosystems. Again, let's look at some of these words in this chart that we have over here, right? So we're looking at this chart right now. So we see that at the bottom of this chart, every time we're going to see this term producers, right? We could also see the word autotroph in there. These are our plants. They are always at the bottom of the food chain. And you can notice over here, right, that this picture shows that energy from the sun is where that first trophic level gets their energy, right? They convert that sun's energy into a usable energy source. And then as we move up the list, right, we see the word first here, we see the word primary, right? Primary means first. So primary consumers are the first consumers. If we look over here, those are things like, in this picture, mice, right? So organisms that eat this first trophic level, that eat plants, right? We also know that they're called herbivores. We'll talk about them in a second, are primary consumers. Then we see this word secondary consumers, and secondary means the second level of consumers, right? So in this picture down here, we see that secondary consumers are something like a snake because the snake eats the mouse. Secondary consumers eat primary consumers. And last but not least, on the top, we see this word tertiary. That means third or the third level of consumers. So that's something like in this picture down here, a hawk, right? So a tertiary consumer will eat the secondary consumer, okay? Okay, now let's talk about food chains. And food chains are a little bit different than food webs, what we see on the bottom down here. So a food chain looks like this, right? This is a food chain. We see just one level of energy flow, right? It's always going in this direction. So it's only showing one order of what different organisms eat. And these are the basic levels of a food chain. And I know that we saw those on the first page, the terms producer and consumer. We can also more specifically talk about what we can call these different levels. So down at the bottom, we know we identified it on the first page that a producer gets energy from the sun, right? That's the first level. But then what eats the plants are called herbivores, right? And we see, it'd be great if I spelled it right, Okay, so our herbivores eat plants or vegetation. Think that you can see the word herb right in there, right? Then organisms that eat other animals are called carnivores. So that root word carni actually means meat or meat eater. So in this case, something like a snake that ate a grasshopper, that snake is eating another animal. It's a carnivore. And last but not least, we have some organisms that eat both, right? Like humans often eat both plants and animals. You might have a salad or you might have a hamburger, and we are called omnivores. So we eat both. So food chains are made up of both of those. And here on this food chain in the bottom, you can see that they also include at the bottom of the food chain, this example where bacteria is an important decomposer that helps return nutrients to the soil, so it kind of all cycles back together again. You guys might have used the terms food chain and food web interchangeably, but the truth is they're a little bit different. A food web is actually defined as being many food chains together. So we can say many interconnected food chains. And food chains are more realistic in nature because they show how certain organisms are eaten and eat way more than one thing, right? So let's just follow one little pattern down here on the bottom. Let's see, if we start with, down here we have some plants, right? And the plants are eaten by this red-breasted nuthatch, which is a bird. And then this bird is eaten by a whiptail lizard, according to this arrow flow. And that whiptail lizard is eaten by a coyote. That would be one food chain. But let's look at a different food chain. Let's look at how maybe we start the same. We have this bird eating the grasshopper and the bird being eaten by a lizard, but then a mountain lion eats the whiptail lizard. Okay? You will notice that energy flows in the direction that the organism is eaten by. So in other words, an arrow, right, represents, and a good way to kind of remember it here, is that the arrow shows where the energy flows. Okay? So we can see here that even though this frog, right, is eating the plant, the arrow goes from the plant to the frog. The arrow is indicating where that energy is going, in this case from the plant to the frog. And the last thing that we need to talk about is this idea of an energy pyramid. So, you know, I pose this question. Think about it. If you eat a 5-pound hamburger, do you gain 5 pounds? And the truth is no, right? So energy is stored. Through digestion and metabolism, we store energy in a variety of different ways. So let's look at this little pyramid that we have down here, okay? We're going to learn this 10% energy rule, and this is what it means. That only 10% of the available energy is transferred to the next level. So every time we move up a trophic level, like this, we actually lose 90% of the energy that's available through digestion, and out into the atmosphere, it's usually released as heat, right? So let's see this math right here down at the bottom, right? So we say that these producers have, for example, 10,000 units of energy, right? And 10% of 10,000, so think of it like this. So here's 10,000, right? And we need only 10%. We move the decimal one place. So that would make this number, 1,000, which we see right here. We move the decimal again, we would have 100. So 10% of 1,000 is 100. And then our last one would just be 10, right? So 10% of 100 is 10. All you have to do is move that decimal place, okay? So notice on the bottom here, I like that this graphic shows that as energy is transferred up the food chain, right, that energy is lost in each level. And it's a lot of energy. It is 90% of energy. And only 10% actually remains in that organism. And this is an example of why there are way more of the organisms that are on the lower end of the food chain, right, or of the energy pyramid. So there's lots and lots and lots of producers, right? But as we move up the food chain, there are fewer and fewer until we get to the lowest amount of what we call these tertiary consumers, or these apex predators. And ecosystems simply can't support a lot of those apex predators because they require so much energy. And by the time the energy gets to them in the food chain, there isn't as much left.